You. So good evening, everyone again. Thank you for joining us for the Health Improvement Collaborative panel series on racism as a public health issue. I'm Makita. I work with Fresh as the Health Equity and Policy Intern. I'm happy to be here tonight with you all. So far, as a part of our series, we've covered an overview of racism as a public health issue. Last month, we focused on racism in the education system. And this month, we're focused on racism in housing. Thank you for entering all of your check-ins in the chat. And welcome to everyone who has just joined us. If you haven't, please check in the chat. As we continue with the night, we know that racism impacts our ability to get stable housing, and that impacts our health directly. So we're going to learn about some history of national racist housing policies and how they impact us locally. First, we'll start with our agenda. So right now we're doing our welcome and our check-ins. Followed by group norms. Then we'll have an introduction of the Health Improvement Collaborative and the Health Equity Framework that we use in our work by Isabel. Then we'll speak on history of systemic racism in housing, as well as the local impact that we see in London and the greater area. Then we'll speak on the connection between housing and health equity. We'll have a lovely video shown by Stephanie. And then we'll move into our panel section. Our panelists tonight are Clayton, Finn, and Leon. A special welcome to them. Followed by a Q&A for a few questions during the panel or anytime tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter them into the chat and we'll try to get to them at the end of the night. And also please stick around for our poll. The poll helps us get funding. So, that's super important for the work that we do. So please stick around for that. It will be super quick. And now we can move on to the group norms. Yes, thank you. So before we jump in, we want to create an open environment for learning about these type of things. It's really important to create a space where we all feel free to learn and feel free to open ourselves up to anything that might make us feel uncomfortable. So we've been participating in these group norms for our series. Just let them marinate. I just want to speak on a few of them. Both and means that two things can be true at the same time, even though they might seem like opposites. For example, both healthy food is expensive and farmers do not get paid enough. For us, the consumers, food might be expensive, but if we look, down the line or up the line, people who are growing this food are already not getting paid enough for it. So, some of the work that we do addresses those problems as well. Also want to give some attention and to lean into discomfort, especially for those of us who might have some or more socioeconomic privilege than others. These conversations don't happen as frequently as we would like them to, but some topics might make you feel uncomfortable, and that's a good thing. That means we're learning and we're growing, and we want to welcome that into the space. So. Next up, we'll have an introduction of the Health Improvement Collaborative by Isabel, and she's going to speak a little bit about the health equity framework that we use in our work.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. I know it's really challenging at the end of a long day to be here with us, and we really appreciate you. While I'm describing our Health Improvement Collaborative, feel free to roll your shoulders and stretch your neck and make yourself comfortable. The Health Improvement Collaborative of Southeastern Connecticut is a group of organizations, including healthcare, public health, academia, philanthropy, first responders, housing, community advocacy groups, and residents who are working together to create opportunities for health in our region. We have a vision that Southeastern Connecticut can be a place where everybody has health in body and mind, and access to health equity, social justice, inclusiveness, and opportunities. Just a little quick history. We came together in 2015 to lead the development of the comprehensive community health needs assessment and community health improvement plans. Those are pretty jargony statements, but this type of planning is required of local health departments and hospitals. And it's a real opportunity to set priorities for a region and bring people together to make change. In 2019, we identified several key priority areas. They include access to care, the Black Health Collective, the Opioid Action Team, Latinx mental health, and really an overarching goal to address racism as a public health issue. So just to take a look at the health equity framework that you have on the slide, it's really wonderful to have this series. You can see all of the boxes in the center form kind of a backbone. These are our spaces where we live, where we play, where we worship, where we work, where we send our kids, where we try to get health care. And the challenge that we face, depending on where we are in society and the color of our skin, is how we're treated in all of those spaces and our access to opportunities and safety in all of those spaces. So today we're going to be really focusing on housing, but there's so many touch points in all of our lives. John A. Powell is a great civil rights scholar who talks about racism, being the water we swim in. It's sometimes hard to see it unless you really stop and really focus and dig in. And that's what really we're trying to do with this racial equity series. So the HIC has identified racism as a public health issue, and this was really based on looking at all of this data that we have around the experiences of people in the region and listening to community members around their priorities. I also want to add that we have another topic area, food justice, which is a newer priority area for our group. And this came about through working with our community ambassadors. We had some funding to work with community members to address really key health priorities and food justice, the ability to access quality, culturally appropriate, affordable food with dignity was a real challenge. And our commitment to this priority area has really deepened with the pandemic in understanding that so many folks are struggling to put food on the table. So I just want to thank you again for being here and let you know that the Health Improvement Collaborative would love to include you in our events and our meetings. We understand that having voices of people in our region talk to us about health priorities is the way that we're going to get this work done. We can't do it without really listening to one another. And we would really urge you, if you want to find out more, to leave us a note in the chat. Let us know you're interested. We can either reach out to you directly if you leave your email, or we can also add you to what we call our digest. And this is a weekly email that you'll receive that will have our meetings on it and also some key resources that we find really helpful around the work that we do. Did I leave anything out, colleagues?
That was good. Thank you so much, Isabel, for that introduction. That was great. So now we're going to move into the meat of the night with some history of the impact of systemic racism in housing and some policies that have birthed from that. So we'll begin with the New Deal. This program was initiated in the 1930s under the Roosevelt administration during the Great Depression. And these programs were said to help stabilize the economy. However, a lot of them led to many racist policies, including redlining and state-sponsored segregation in public housing. So for those of you who do not know, redlining includes maps indicating communities to insure mortgages to. And at this time, neighborhoods of color were boxed in red and were excluded from that process. Also beginning under the New Deal, we have public housing. And we know a lot about public housing nowadays, but it did start with state-sponsored segregation. White-only housing was initiated to address certain housing shortages in that community. And for decades, people of color were prohibited from buying homes in the suburbs and in these white housing areas outside of urban housing projects. Over time, as vacancies grew in white housing projects, or I shouldn't say projects, white housing areas, the waiting list in communities of color also grew. So we see some inequities beginning in that area. Next up, we have the Federal Housing Administration, which includes government subsidies to grant housing loans to folks. And up until the 1960s, people of color did not have legal access to these loans due to redlining and other racist policies. Fortunately, today we know that redlining is legally outlawed, but many policies still enforce the same inequitable practices, unfortunately. Lastly, I'll speak a little bit about urban renewal programs. And these programs were funded through Federal Housing Acts in 1937, 49, 54, and 65, and lasted legally through 1974. And they did a great job at displacing many families to benefit private enterprise and business. And we still see the effects of this urban renewal today, even in our own town in New London. We'll speak a little bit more about that later on tonight, but we just want to start with some history. And next we have some graphs on the local impact of housing. So the first one is on housing affordability. And as you can see, over a third of residents in Connecticut and the greater New London area spend over 30% of their income on their housing. And it's generally known that when residents spend over 30% on housing, they struggle to pay for other necessities like healthcare, transportation, childcare, food, and that's a major problem. On the right, we have another graph on some home ownership information. And basically, it just lets us know that housing instability is still a great problem in our area. And we know that housing stability contributes to healthy neighborhoods, it contributes to a sense of community, and poor quality and inadequate housing contributes to many health problems that we'll touch on a little bit later tonight. But now we will see a video shown by Stephanie on some ways that housing inequity can impact our health.
Good evening, everyone. Just bear with me 1 second. I'm just going to pull this video up.
We had vast public investments in building the suburbs of America. Federally supported loans, FHA loans, went to people who were moving to the suburbs, and for many years, up until the 60s, those loans were available on a racially restricted basis. African Americans and other people of color didn't have access to them.
Until 1962, out of $120 billion in government-backed home loans, less than 2% went to non-white households. In Northern California, between the war and 1960, of 350,000 federally guaranteed new home loans, less than 100 went to Black families. In cities like Richmond, African Americans were left behind in increasingly neglected neighborhoods. In the 1980s, poor Latino and Southeast Asian immigrants began joining them in these same neighborhoods.
Once the community starts to go downhill, nobody wants to actually invest in the community, so the banks don't want to come in and the shops don't want to come in. Then you don't have a commercial base, you don't have the community taxes that can then feed back into the schools. Now you don't have good schools, so families don't want to move into the community if they don't have to because you don't have good schools, and you get a sort of vicious cycle of everybody who can will leave the community.
This isn't something that happens overnight, and it isn't the fault of the people who live there. The people who live in low-income, disinvested communities did not do this to themselves.
20 years before his heart attack, Kwai tried to move his family out of Richmond, but 11 months later, they had to move back.
I can't find my job up there, and she can't find her job up there. And move back, my older son, hang around with the wrong group and then use some kind of drug. I just don't know what to do. I try to help him. I try to straighten him out. Spend a lot of money, owe people a lot of money. That's what in my mind all the time. So it's worry, just worry. When I'm going to pay up all of this, and how I'm going to do it.
If you think about when you're worried, you're always a little bit more activated. There's a little bit more vigilance. You're sort of checking things out a little bit more carefully. And if you can imagine that happening day after day, all day, every day, it's exhausting. And it wears on the body system.
When stress is chronic, when we're endlessly worried about our bills, our job, our children's safety, the body pumps out cortisol and adrenaline. But too much of these stress hormones over time can increase arterial plaque, raise blood pressure, and weaken our immune system, increasing our risk for almost every chronic disease, including heart disease, the leading killer in America.
We've done studies that have shown that living in disadvantaged neighborhoods is related to an increased risk. It's about 50 to 80% increase in risk of developing heart disease. And this has been replicated in other studies.
So that was a small clip from Unnatural Causes. Is Inequality Making Us Sick? Sorry. I didn't realize that I had like my autoplay going. That's gonna be fun with the recording. Okay. Unnatural Causes, Is Inequality Making Us Sick? And that episode was Place Matters. You can find most of it on YouTube. And so it really just talks to really about how where you live excuse me, influences your health outcomes, right? Something I found really interesting was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation has a life expectancy tool. So you can like type in your address. So just because I'm a nerd like that, I typed in my mom's address. So we live in New London. She is in the 3rd district, like down past Metro College. And so the life expectancy there is 80.3 years. And a couple of years ago, I moved into the 2nd district. And just for the heck of it, I decided to see what the difference in life expectancy is. And I shaved almost 5 years of life expectancy off. It went from 80.3 in the 3rd district to 75.5 where I currently live. So I just want you all to keep these things in mind as we listen to our panel of experts and keep all of the things that they say, keep that in mind as we think about how access to like home ownership opportunities and like safe, affordable, quality housing influences how healthy we can be or not. So I'd like to, I don't know if Makita, you need to share your screen so that we can present the panelists. So what I'm going to ask you all to do is just say, who you are just for a couple minutes and just take a couple minutes to introduce yourself. And then we'll go right into this list of questions I have for you so we can engage in a good conversation. So first up, Clayton, would you please come off mute and introduce yourself and tell us about you and your work?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm glad I actually get to go first. My name is Clayton Potter, and I say that because I am not a professional or an expert by any means in housing and housing equity. I am a homeowner here in New London. I own a home that was the first home sold by the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust. I'll share more about that later, but I believe that I'm here for my experience, and I'm happy to share about what my process and experience has been in terms of working with the Community Land Trust. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people might have at the end. But I'll go ahead and I'll pass it on to my fellow panelists.
Thank you. And next up, we have Fanula.
Hey, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for including me on this panel. And I really just want to give a shout out to recognizing some of the fair housing history that goes into how we've created one of the most segregated states in the country. And so, as Makita said, my name is Fanula Darby Hudgens. I'm the Director of Operations for the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. We are the largest civil rights nonprofit in Connecticut, and we work to ensure that everybody has equal access to the housing of their choice, free from discrimination. I've been with the center almost 5 years now, but that's a little bit of a misnomer because I was actually their intern when I was in college, so I left and I came back. But I am also a Southeastern Connecticut resident. I live in Norwich, and I live in Norwich downtown. It was very intentional to live there, and I'm just really excited to be a part of this discussion tonight. This is my everyday work, talking about housing discrimination and zip code destiny.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Leon.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Leon Guzman. I'm a local New London resident and also a realtor in the New London area. I've been licensed since 2014. You guys can find me on LinkedIn or Facebook. I've been passionate about housing, and I want to share my story a little bit about why I became a realtor. And it was because of my own personal issues. When my wife and I were looking for housing, we ran into a lot of issues that we felt were discriminatory. So at the time, I didn't know what resources or to access or who I could turn to. So I kind of took matters into my own hand in 2014 and became licensed to kind of scratch my own itch, but also be an advocate for others facing similar issues. Thanks for having me tonight.
Thank you. Thank all of you. So I'm just going to launch into the questions. Earlier, we spoke about urban renewal programs funded through several of the federal housing acts over nearly 4 decades, with intentions to clear low-income housing to benefit private enterprise, displacing many. So we know what happened nationally. Fionnuala, can you talk to us about urban renewal in New London, please?
Sure, Ken, and thank you so much for this question and really kind of being interested in this research. So if it's okay, I'm going to share a few slides only because I think pictures are a lot more interesting to look at than me. And some of them are definitely related to directly to New London, and most folks find these pretty interesting. So just a quick thumbs up that show, maybe you can't see it just yet. Should share. Can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Cool.
All
right. So, yeah, sure. I'm going to click through them a little bit. So what I wanted to do was first show, and Makita actually did this so well at the beginning, is that urban renewal was built on a platform of decades and decades of discriminatory housing policy, where both federal and state governments invested in neighborhoods and housing opportunities for white folk while intentionally disinvesting in opportunities for housing for people of color. And we did this over and over and over and over again. So urban renewal is just one piece of legacy of discriminatory housing policy. And I think we're going to talk a little bit later about how this continues to be perpetuated even in our pandemic relief response, right? Even in how we are responding to the housing instability caused by COVID-19. And so this slide just really shows you about 120 years of housing policy that very intentionally funded money and subsidies into housing opportunities for white folk while dismantling housing opportunities for people of color. And I repeat that because I think it's important for us to naturalize that rhetoric, right? And make sure that we're all level setting, right? Some shared norms. And so urban renewal in New London was just one piece of a large puzzle that left New London, Connecticut hyper segregated, right? For those of you who live there, you understand that even right down to the block level, where you live is tremendously segregated by race. So New London, oddly enough, because it's such a small municipality, had one of the largest urban renewal projects in the Northeast around the Winthrop Cove area. And this map, this side-by-side map, shows you this yellow area here, shows you the 10 streets that were lost to urban renewal in the 1960s. And this was federally sponsored blight clearance, right? And so what happened is the federal government paid the city of New London to tear down an entire neighborhood in the name of slum clearance, also known as urban renewal. But what we have to remember, and in the slide I showed previously, is that the reason that these neighborhoods had become become so disinvested and in such need of care is because we had spent the 50 years prior intentionally disinvesting in them, right? We disinvested in where people of color lived. And I think this quote just really sums up what was lost. And so the author, James Rose, describing urban renewal in New London, Connecticut, describes this as driving down towards Shapley Street. I noticed right away that the whole Black district had been wiped out by urban renewal. All of my old haunts were being torn down, and it was as if a whole part of me had been uprooted and lost to time. And so urban renewal in New London displaced what we know of about 790 families. So really countless residents when you think about the children and partnerships that were probably within each residence that was displaced. And the housing was also never replaced. I'm going to skip a few of these because Makita did such a good job at sharing our history. But the next few slides are really just kind of showing you some of the pictures of what was lost. So one of the streets that was lost was Church Street, which is now Governor Winthrop Boulevard. And like most urban renewal projects across the country, private investment never came. And in part because what happened was at the same time that they were tearing down neighborhoods of color, they were investing where white folk lived. So, and I say they, general they, federal government, state government, and municipal government. And so for those of you who live in New London, you understand that this area that I'm speaking about is now mostly parking garages, right? A hotel, perhaps. And I'm going to click through quickly and just show you guys a few different pictures. So you can see, so this is one of the appraisal reports, and I did a fair amount of oral histories when I was studying urban renewal in New London, Connecticut. But what they did was when they came to clear the neighborhood, I mean, they leveled streets, like streets that just don't exist anymore, predominantly Black neighborhood and predominantly Black home ownership, right, which was then eventually lost. So Eileen Pye was a resident at the time whose home was appraised during urban renewal, and her family never recovered their access to home ownership, right? So they lost home ownership as a result of urban renewal on Hill Street, and they never reclaimed it. Now, Eileen stated very clearly that the neighborhood was in desperate need of infrastructure, right? It needed public sewer, it needed public water, it needed better access to fire safety and cars, but it didn't necessarily need to be demolished. And we provided all that infrastructure to white neighborhoods. Think about Waterford, right? Like we built them the highway, we built them water, we built them plumbing, we built them sewer. But instead, when we came around to renewal in where people of color live, we just tore it down. And again, this is another just appraisal report for a house on Shapley Street. And this was who I spoke with, Mr. Harris. His family also never regained access to home ownership. And because this is how Americans typically garner wealth, is through their home ownership, when home ownership is lost within a family, it often is a generational impact. And then I'll just show a few more photos here. So this was actually Main Street in New London. And one of the things that was most common in my interviews with folks who had lived during urban renewal in Connecticut is that urban renewal took away the walkability of downtown New London. And in addition, it took away access to walkable groceries. Of course, that's not quite the case now with Fiddleheads, but there was a large chain grocery store in downtown New London pre-urban renewal, which ironically now is a police station. So we knocked down a Black neighborhood and built a police station. And again, you'll see another neighborhood, and Bibi Norm and Deborah Carter were sisters who lived in the neighborhood that was torn down. And they actually describe it as this really like loving and welcoming community where people grew their own food in their backyards, and people had chickens, and people shared things, and right. And so it was not only just the loss of housing for people of color and the loss of a Black neighborhood, but also really the loss of a community. And I have an entire walking tour that we put together, but I have it digitized on our website. So if anybody, I'll throw the link in the chat when I'm done speaking. But really what happened with urban renewal in New London was it displaced a thriving Black neighborhood, and it was never rebuilt. And unfortunately, that is a fate that perpetuated. I mean, it was just in 2017 where we emptied Crystal Ave Apartments, 124 families were displaced from their housing. Many ended up outside of the community. The housing was never replaced, and that is the last family subsidized housing in New London, Connecticut.
Thank you so much for that. It is, that's a very distressing and heartbreaking accounting of our city. I just want to kick it out to either Clayton or Leon to see if you all have come across anything as far as the impact of urban renewal and the stuff that Fionnuala was just talking about in your experiences.
I would just add to the very last point Fionnuala mentioned is, you know, Crystal Ave was torn down. The residents were given options some were given options to relocate elsewhere outside of the city, but the proposals to provide new housing for them here in the city were still pushed back by community members. And Crystal Avenue had a reputation and stereotypes, and people didn't want those folks moving into their neighborhood. So things are just continuing, and they happen and play out in explicit, implicit, and formal government level ways and on different social and communal ways. So thank you for sharing all of that excellent knowledge.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that with urban renewal, just like a lot of other federal programs or policies that say that they're supposed to be temporary, they always pretty much end up being a permanent type situation. And as you all spoke on the situation with Crystal Avenue, it hurt me to see so many families get displaced. And when they did receive, when previous tenants of Crystal Avenue did receive those vouchers, they were being discriminated against by landlords. So we lost a large portion of our minority and low income population due to that process. And it was like, I don't understand what was supposed to be the weighted benefit of tearing this down if you're not going to keep the members of the community, because the members of the community is the greatest assets of a community.
Leanne, I just love that you said that. So I was actually, when Crystal Ave was displaced, I was actually still doing casework. And so the 124 families that were displaced were my clients. And I worked closely with all of the families in that displacement case. So housing discrimination against individuals using a subsidy to pay their rent, meaning a Section 8 voucher or an in-place subsidy, is the second highest form of discrimination in Connecticut. The first is disabilities. Many of my clients in that time faced 25, 30 apartment denials before they found housing. And the treatment of those families, both from the courts and the city and the housing authority, the nicest way to put it was just blatant racism. It was horrific. It to this day remains one of the hardest cases I've ever done, I would say, without any reward.
Yeah, I'm just gonna piggyback on that really quick. So when I worked at the health department, we did a lot of work with the residents. And so it broke my heart, like the way things were panning out. And I was actually on the housing commission, but most of my votes were in the minority. It was always folks voting for the greater agenda. So after just a little bit over a year, I had to resign because I just, in my heart, didn't feel like they had the residents' best interests at heart. So just really just echoing all of the things that you all said. I'm gonna transition because we could stay there and I'm gonna get mad. So we're gonna transition. Leon, as a realtor in the New London area, what are some inequitable issues you've noticed in the home buying process for folks with lower income and for Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks?
Basically, not to oversimplify, but it's just the affordability, especially in a market like today, where it's a seller's market, and you have maybe out of town buyers or retirees who were previous homeowners selling their homes that they had equity in, or selling it for top dollar and paying. I'm seeing 40, 50, 60, even $70,000 over asking price. And we're purchasing a home, it's a numbers game. And someone mentioned earlier that believe it was Makita was talking about the you don't want to go over 30%, but FHA itself allows people to purchase a home with 31 on the front end and 43% on the back end for their debt ratios. And I believe that is tremendously high. So you couple that with higher prices, and you don't have enough housing for people. It boxes them out. Also, it creates another phenomenon with pent up demand for rental space. And so when there's that much demand for rental, it even causes the rental prices to skyrocket. So it's really if you're low income, you're in between a rock and a hard place. You don't make enough to purchase, but rents are on par or sometimes more than owning. So what do you do at that point?
Thank you. So I'm gonna have a couple more questions for you. So technically it's outlawed, right? But do you see redlining as still being an influencer of homeownership opportunities?
I would say so. And the thing about it being outlawed doesn't mean that it's still not being done. And so it was easier to say, yeah, there's redlining because we see these laws on the books. And so now, in order to catch it, you basically have to go, someone or agency or someone has to go undercover, or people have to come out and tell their stories about it happening before we actually know about it. But we definitely know that it's happening. I personally have had clients who were told that they couldn't afford a home. I took them to another lender and they became homeowners. So it's very much well and alive.
Okay. As you talk with your clients, do you see big differences in the assets from neighborhood to neighborhood, like schools, parks, sidewalks? And if yes, how does that impact access for like Black and Brown families as a way to choose where they want to live?
Okay, so I'll start with the first question. There's definitely a difference in assets. For instance, when it comes to things that are available for the youth, you go to other communities in Southeastern Connecticut, and you'll see open YMCAs and things for the youth to do. And so our youth will have to travel to Mystic or other towns or Stonington just to access those facilities because they're no longer available in our communities. Also, when you look, just like in the video, New London doesn't really have a commercial base, so it doesn't have that tax base. And so there's a lot of things going on there as far as assets. So I would say pretty much New London has less assets, fewer things that make it stand out and more comfortable to live. And it's just that trickle effect. When you have a community that's impoverished, it's you have poorer schools, you have more crime, and all those things that make neighborhoods undesirable, so to speak. And so, can you repeat the second part of that question?
So if you saw the differences in the assets, how does that impact access for Black and Brown families, and the way folks choose sort of like where they want to live?
That's an interesting question, and so it's kind of a catch-22 because for a lot of low income people, they really don't have a choice in where they want. They can't go to a neighborhood where they have access to these things. They have to go to where they can afford. So it's not so much of where they want to be as much as where they can afford.
Thank you. Clayton, in the past year, due to financial impact of COVID-19 pandemic, there's been increased talk of rent stabilization, mortgage relief, deferred payments, and eviction bans. Can you talk about what are some other progressive housing policies or programs that you think could increase equity in housing?
Sure. So I think, a lot of those programs that you mentioned some of them are responsive. And we know that when we're responding to things in the moment, it's not necessarily going to be sustainable, or it might not always be here. There are a lot of approaches, though, that have brought communities together and brought different organizational resources together for people. And I think that is where most of the potential lies, especially for a community or a town like London. If we're thinking about how it was explained earlier, governments have divested in our city. We know that housing favors white people and wealthier people. We know that New London is a majority town. We don't have money, plain and simple. And I think as a person who's always been involved with nonprofits, I've got my home from a nonprofit, and I started learning about housing through really nonprofit organizations. Eastern Connecticut Housing Organization, ECHO, HOPE, Housing Opportunities. I need help with that acronym. But there's so many different local organizations that are approaching all of the complex problems that come with housing, whether it's just navigating, finding a home, saving for a home, understanding the transitions from renting to homeownership. If we're coming together, we're using these resources, if we're making people aware, if we're helping people along the path, because we know that even if you have money, buying a home is a process. There's always things to learn. And I think that coming together through these community organizations, whether they are helping us buy homes, helping us provide education, is really the way to go. In other words, we have to do the work ourselves. These community organizations are the people. They're people who are on the ground. They're connecting locally, and they are fighting against the private developers or community or like city rehabilitation programs. That was the word I was looking for. When you mark something as blight, and then now you have a whole lot of ways to say something needs to change and give people like investors, private investors, the opportunity to come and swoop something up. So I think it's really about using our community organizations and coming together and trying to just stay ahead of the game with our knowledge.
Thank you. I just want to make an offer to either Fionnuala or Leon to add anything if you have anything to add to that.
Leon, did you want to go? Because I can wait.
Yes, I just want to say in response to COVID that there was there's some resources through United CT at ct.gov for rental assistance, because I know a lot of people was inquiring about that and don't necessarily know where to go. So that was just, so I didn't want to put it out there.
No, that's great. I was actually going to mention Unite CT and then some of the problems with Unite CT. So Unite CT is the state's rental assistance program. There's $235 million available to tenants to pay up to $10,000, 6 months in rental arrears, 6 months going forward, and an additional $1,500 in rental or utility assistance. The problem is that in Connecticut, 80% of people of color rent their homes in comparison to only 30% of white families who rent their homes. And so there's a real disparate impact in who needs rental assistance, right? And so again, we're talking about policy that's going to be disparately accessed by people of color or renters. And right now, the program is not set up to be accessible in a way that it is easy to access funding. There is tremendous amounts of documentation burdens. It doesn't translate into multiple languages. You have to out yourself as undocumented or without status if you're looking for funding. And the list goes on and on and on and on. Again, I can put a link on our website of the problems with Unite CT. We are taking on clients who are struggling to access rental arrearage funds, but there is $235 million available right now. And then in the American Recovery Act that came down from Congress in January, there's another $270 million for rental support. So we're looking at $500 million in rental assistance in Connecticut.
Okay, thank you. On the topic of obtaining secure housing, what do each of you want more people in New London and the county to know? That's like a general question. And then I have a second question for Clayton. I was wondering if you could talk to us about your experience securing a home with the Community Land Trust.
So I guess I'll start saying about what I'd like to see. I would like to see maybe some better zoning laws, because when you think about redlining, and even though, like you said, that's been outlawed, it's uncanny. Like in a lot of cities, if you overlay these zoning maps with redlining, they're almost carbon copy. And so the issue with the zoning is, if for people who may not understand how it impacts affordable housing, is that in some instances there's zoning laws that says you can't build a home unless it's a certain amount of square footage. And so if you increase the square footage that can be built on a lot, then that means you're pricing low income people out of home ownerships. Also, a lot of cities tend to restrict the amount of multifamily homes that can be built, or and so, to try to preserve the integrity of their communities, like they would say, and that reduces the amount of affordable housing that's available. So I would like to see some of the zoning policies looked at and change to better impact our low income people.
I would like more people to know about what it means to own a home. And I'm still learning, but beyond just the space for your family or for privacy, your home is an asset financially. And it comes back to this conversation, this larger conversation that we're having. If, we can be low income people, moderate income people who are able to obtain homes, that's a really big stepping stone, and it positions you better for other opportunities in life that you might not even be aware of or, privy to, just because you don't own a home, or even as a homeowner, we're not aware of this information. I learn things every week that I can do, or benefits I can obtain because I own a home, whether it's from filing my taxes and having write-offs, or I'm learning about how I'll be able to take equity out of my home and I can liquefy the value of my home. And there's so many just different benefits, and there's reasons why your home is an asset. So I think just the learning process and understanding that there's so much value in having a home and not having a home, and who has access. And that's why these conversations are really important. It's not just about having a space for privacy or having a space for, you know, a yard for your dog or whatever. It runs deep.
Thank you. And Clayton, would you mind talking to us? I'm sorry, we're not trying to get like all in your business, but just
no, I'm ready to share it all, and I am
like
excited.
the process of like,
yes.
you know, getting your home through the land trust. I'm sure everyone else is interested, but I'm like super. I want all the tea. So please share.
So as I have stated, like I think education, sharing the knowledge is super critical for us to, you know, move each other forward, each one teach one. So I am actually going to share, I'm happy to share my full story and be explicit. So I don't know many people on this call, so Clayton Potter, I'm born and raised in New London. I went through the public school system. I graduated in 2014 from the London High School. I went to Columbia and studied English literature and graduated from there in 2018. I came back to New London, which was always my intention. I wanted to teach, but then I decided to get involved in nonprofits, and I found that that's how I can make the impact I seek to through nonprofits. So I work at Connecticut College as a community learning coordinator right now, and I started there in 2018. When I started, I made up, I'm going to tell you like financials too. So I made $18.20 when I started, $19.20 when I started in 2018 in October. That was my first grown-up job. I knew I wanted a home since I had been young. My parents owned a home on Pleasant Street, and I had a goal to be able to save that 10 to 20% that we're told we need to save to be able to purchase a home, the bare minimum. And my goal was to be able to purchase a home at the end of 2021. I made that decision in 2018. In 2019, it was around Thanksgiving, and I was on Facebook for doing work, making a post. I came across a post from the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust. Hadn't heard of this organization, but the post said, "Do you want to own a home? Do you think you can't afford to?" Yes, yes. And I followed up. I met with Rain Doherty, who was the executive director at the time. They had my current home for sale, 34 Press Street. And it is a home that was built in 1850 by George Prest, and it's on Press Street. So it has historical implications in itself. And the Land Trust, the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust, is a nonprofit charitable organization that holds land for the development and stewardship of permanently affordable housing, land for food production, green space, and facilities for community organizations. So when I learned that this home was being sold by a community land trust, I had to inquire more about what that meant. I learned about the mission, and I learned that the land trust has a model for making homes affordable to low to moderate income people who are looking to buy homes. So the land trust was able to sell me my home below market value. And it's also a 2-family home, and it had tenants at the time. It still has tenants, thankfully. So I purchased my home. I met with Rain in November of 2019. I worked with Keith Turner and Homestead Funding, who was recommended by the Land Trust. And I understood why when I got to his office, because he had all the names of the different organizations I mentioned earlier that were nonprofit organizations, and he understood the land trust and their motto and was supportive in making sure that people like me could still qualify for mortgages. So the land trust, Rain in particular, and Keith worked with me throughout that 2 to 3 month period of me pre-qualifying to qualifying and obtaining a mortgage and becoming the owner of 34 Press. So I also had to take a couple classes because I was going to be a landlord and because I was a first-time home buyer, and I learned so much. It was really worthwhile. I have the booklets, I refer to them often, and I also was able to there were different financing options that were so affordable for me, and I didn't really have to put much money down on the home to be able to purchase it for closing costs. I never had to put a 10%, and it was actually 2.5, I believe. So that's like all my deets, and I just want people to know that this is the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust first home. They work to provide space with organizations like Fresh, but I say that it was their first home. We're still working to provide other opportunities to people, but this is life-changing for me. I can speak about some of the ways that just I'm learning and I've benefited personally, like in terms of my health. But you know, we're looking to do this again for more and more people because it does make housing accessible. It creates, it's part of the motto, the land trust, and keeping it permanently, there's lights and sirens outside my home, which brings me to another point about Press Street and the desirability of the neighborhood. I'm proud to live on Press Street, a couple blocks away from where I grew up the street from a Fresh community garden where I have plots, and on land that has been farmed for hundreds of years here in New London. So just in the moment. But some of the benefits that I've had in terms of just owning a home. Right away, when I had to start saving for a home, one of the things they tell you is like just ramen noodles and no going out, you know? Okay, boom, ramen noodles. I can not go out, but I don't like to eat ramen noodles. Ramen noodles aren't healthy for me and my body. They don't give me the nutrients I need. And that logic of, you know, buying cheap food and minimizing what you have to be able to obtain this home is like where you start to see problems happening. But I did what I had to do. I purchased my home. I purchased a 2-family home. It had tenants. They don't pay all of the mortgage, but they pay a significant amount, which makes the home affordable. And it helps me to save money and to be able to make sure that I have savings for when something wrong happens with the house. And I won't lie, as a homeowner, you have more responsibilities because things go wrong. You're aware of all the things that go wrong with the home or with the building. I might tighten a screw probably every weekend around here, but that's a beauty in itself because I've gained so many new skills and comfort levels in new places. Access to having a yard, green space during COVID, that became an extreme blessing. You know, being able to see my family socially distanced outside, being able to grow food. I was able to do that for the first time last year from myself, and I did it. I have my plot going now. And then space and privacy, comfort, and security. It's different sleeping in a home when I know my doors are locked and I chose my neighborhood, and I don't hear all sorts of people running up and down through the night in my apartment levels, which has been, you know, my story since I went off to college in 2014. And it changes how I sleep and how my stress level is and how I can manage and cope. And then there's the financial benefits that I'm only learning right now that come down the line with owning a home. So there's just so much that makes it truly life-changing, like in every sense of the word. And I'm extremely thankful for the land trust. One thing I did want to mention is the motto. I was speaking about that when I lost track. They have, part of their motto is that they will own the land in perpetuity, such that it can always be affordable. If I choose to leave this home, if I sell it or move, I am working within the Southeastern Connecticut Land Trust motto to keep it affordable to the next people and for whomever is going to be here for the years to come. So any questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'll share my email. My name is Clayton Potter, and you can find me as such on Facebook or LinkedIn, but I'm happy to talk about all the steps I had to take in learning, people, to introduce you to people I met, educational resources, whatever it may be. So that's my story. Thank you all for giving me time to share.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for sharing it.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, that's amazing. And just to hear you talk about how homeownership has changed your health, right? So, in the little video, they talked about the stress levels, right? And so just to hear the security that you have and how it's lowered your stress levels and you're growing your own food, that's dope. So really thank you for sharing that with us. So I have one last question because we're coming to the end of our discussion. Fionnuala, we're starting to hear more about how zoning laws are making it hard to create low-income housing in suburban areas in Connecticut. Can you talk more about how these zoning laws still impact communities? And I know Leon started it, but if you could talk about the affordable housing, appreciate that.
Wow, Clayton's story was so interesting and moving and touching, and zoning is so boring that it is a really hard act to follow. I will say, and I'm sorry, I'm going to steal a minute here. Clayton, Anita Hill writes a lot about home, and the story you just shared really reminded me of her words. And I just want to say that I found your story and the bravery that you told it to be really powerful. So thank you for sharing tonight. It's really amazing work. So zoning is really boring. Zoning is land use policy, and it is how we decide what we will build and where we will build it. In Connecticut, every single municipality has the right to zone their communities however they choose. So even when you look at a place like the City of New London, they've zoned what types of housing have access to what land. And so if you look at Willets Ave, right, in New London, that is a dividing line between wealth and single-family home ownership, right, and multifamily housing. And notice where they put oceanfront development, right? They gave it to folks who have access to single-family housing. And that is a phenomenon we see across the country, but really in the Northeast. So a city like Waterford, right, which as Leon describes is one of those communities that is considered to be well-resourced, right? So good schools and good rec departments, or Mystic, right, with an active Y, or Stonington with an active Y. Those towns use zoning to limit the development of both affordable and multifamily housing. And they literally have it in the municipal regs that say, we will not permit the development of multifamily or affordable housing in these specific areas. Over 30 communities in the state do not allow any multifamily development. And then many communities that allow some multifamily development, as Leon said, have such high restrictions within the zoning regs that make the development impossible to actually do. This year in the legislative session in the General Assembly, there was lots of different legislation posed to make zoning more inclusionary. The terms are exclusionary and inclusionary when we talk about zoning. Again, really boring. And what was really disheartening in the whole thing, and I'm happy to share some links so you could hear, is just the amount of really blatant, not even coded racism when talking about opening up zoning to a diversity of housing developments. And unfortunately, this was from our legislature. right? And so I started to feel like this past session that maybe our fair housing goals are not achieved through land use policy, right? Maybe they're achieved through stories like Clayton by empowering the people we have spent decades disempowering.
Thank you for that. And I just want to extend on behalf of myself and the Health Improvement Collaborative, thanks to all three of you all for being part of this panel, for sharing all of your knowledge and experiences with us. And to everyone else who is here with us tonight, we do have a few minutes left. If you have questions for our panelists, if you could please add them into the chat, and we will certainly have someone ask the panelists our questions, and all of their contact information was put in the chat, and we'll make sure that when we send a follow-up email that all the links and resources that have been shared tonight will be included in that email. Sorry, Alicia and Makeda, I just made more work for you. I apologize, but
that is no problem. We're happy to share all of that. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I'm not someone who's going to monitor the chat. So if you have questions, we have a little bit of time. And I'm going to give you a little more time because I actually have two of my own that I'm going to steal space with. So I apologize already. My first question is for Leon. Leon, we got to hear Clayton's amazing story. That was powerful and inspiring. And I am curious, you probably hear the opposite of that. You probably hear some struggle on your side when you're trying to get people in the traditional system. So not to bring it down, but I'm just sort of curious, what you see families going through who have to go through a traditional system, not the alternative one that Clayton got to go through.
Well, one of the first things is a lot of people, it's the mystique around home ownership. A lot of people tend to think that home ownership will be burdensome. They think that, oh, well, I rather rent. Like you could do what if you want to rent versus own, that's fine. I'm not trying to sway people either way, but I just want people to have the knowledge to make an informed and educated decision. And so a lot of people would think that it's easier to rent or that they'll have less problems by renting versus home ownership. That's just not the case all the time. Because at the end of the day, homes, your landlord, that same property can have issues the same way that a home can have issues. The difference is you control it, and who pays for either way. Even you say, okay, my landlord will pay if the plumbing gets broken, but he or she is paying that with your rental income. And to piggyback off what Clay was speaking to, he said he had tenants, and so that's helpful too. If that's an alternative, because sometimes people they truly can't afford. And I had one family who couldn't afford a traditional home, but when I ran the numbers for a multifamily home, and they found out that they can use a percentage of that rental income as their income to increase how much house they could afford, they were able to get into a multifamily property, whereas traditionally they couldn't do it. They wouldn't have been able to afford a single family home. So that those are like some of the struggles I see. Also, when it comes to credit, a lot of people that they have these apps like Credit Karma, and they think that that's their credit score, and so they don't understand how credit works, and so they don't understand the difference between a FICO score, which is what your lender uses, and a consumer credit report, which is what Credit Karma uses. And so I've seen as big as 100-point differences in those scores. So sometimes people they'll think, oh, my credit score is low, run their FICO score, and like you can actually afford your credit score is to where it needs to be to buy a home, or it may need a little work. So that's like some of the things that I've seen.
Yeah, and that sounds like amazing to have someone who knows those tricks looking out for you to do that, to work that system. Because I just remember buying my own house. The system was so frustrating and hard. And it's actually why I became involved in the land trust volunteering and to begin with, because I was like, I want to use this knowledge somehow. So I appreciate that, Leon. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I think this next one is.
Can I say something before we move on? And so I know Clayton said that his interest was 2.5%. I just want to say that that's a very low, good interest rate, because even with FHA, it was a little higher than that. So so if you can pay lower interest, that's phenomenal.
Great, thank you for adding that. Okay, I'm going to jump into the last two questions in the chat. So I think this one can be for anyone, but I have a feeling, Fionnuala, this one's a little bit geared towards you. And Joanne asks us, is there a way to legally offer homeownership opportunities to people of color who lost their homes to urban renewal? There are so many laws around quote unquote fairness that actually restrict fairness.
Thanks, Alicia, for that question. And I also read it. So I'm going to take it backwards if that's okay. So I have some concern, and this is just my job as a fair housing advocate, that we've put quotations around the mark fairness. The Fair Housing Act is the most seminal piece of civil rights legislation we have in our country, right? So it's not fairness based on like some arbitrary rule. It's actually fairness based on protecting members who are in protected classes, right? Across all housing transactions, right? So that includes fair lending. I think the second part of your question is really asking about reparations, right? And I think that is something that should absolutely be considered. There has been pockets of thinking about reparations linked to home ownership opportunities or housing opportunities across the country, mostly because there's such an influx of federal funding right now. But especially listening to members of the Black and African American community, they feel that, and I would appreciate Leon's or Clayton's take on this, that the efforts that have been made towards reparations are very tokenized, and that they're not at all equitable or equal to what should actually be achieved. And then there's a lot of barriers to home ownership, and mostly they're related really out of racism and discrimination. I mean, it was only in 2018 the Fair Housing Center sued Liberty Bank for redlining, right? So, and won. So those types of things have continued to happen, and they continue to happen every day. So I didn't really answer your question. I think I talked about it. I apologize.
Clayton or Leon, do you all want to touch on reparations? Fionnuala was kind of tossing it over.
Yes, reparations is definitely something that's needed when it comes to housing, because when you try to fix things like that, it tends to be just like what the laws that's out now. They tend to be all encompassing and pretty neutral. So those things affected, Blacks specifically. So the remedy needs to be specific.
For that. We have one more question in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes or so to answer. I'm just prefacing that before because I don't want to be the person who asks Cambria. But our question from Jen in the chat is, I am wondering about the panelists' thoughts around what Leon mentioned earlier about what's happening with the housing market in New London. How do we protect our sense of community and our community members? Oh, I'm losing it. Sorry. I tried to go down and then I lost everything. Sorry. Okay. At a point in time when they're being pushed out of housing, rental or ownership, with the federal money coming in to the city and the council election coming up, what should we be advocating to happen next in our city?
I think one thing that needs to happen I've said this before, but the education, for instance, like the knowledge Leon was sharing, we don't learn these things until we're in the process. And if we know ahead of time, that's how we can make it easier. Like, for instance, if it's a credit score thing and you're either waiting to go get a house because you think your score is too low, or you get there and it's not right and now you have to go back, or just knowing about your lending options. And my story is unique, and it's like, you know, the idea, it's picturesque compared to like the reality of like finding a home through traditional means, but it's possible. It shows like it's possible. So we can come together through these different organizations. I think that we need to use each other, use our community organizations, and then I think that we need to attack policy, start on local levels. You know, we've heard how these things are written really explicitly here in our local communities. Let's change that. You know, we have the local land trust that does work in New London, and we also have the Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust that's thinking about the county. So there's so many different organizations, and there's people who are committed, and there's people who have the knowledge. If you have questions, ask them, and if you have knowledge, share.
Awesome. Thank you. Leon or Fionnuala, do you want to add something? Leon, go ahead.
Yes, I don't want to hold up too much space, but I just want to say that, like Clayton said, having people be informed, be knowledgeable, not just on the financial end, but also civically, you know what I'm saying, understanding what's going on in community and know what laws are on the books that are adversely affecting the community, so that we can all become civically engaged to change these things. So if we know that redlining and zoning are some of the issues, like go on a site like Desegregate Connecticut and see actually how much land is set aside for multifamily housing or affordable housing. And if it's not enough, compare, because that's how you gauge what's enough. So what's that threshold? You will have to say compare to what? And so look at comparable cities and then make a judgment, you know, say, well, compared to this city and the median income and the population and the housing, it's really not enough. You're not even in the ballpark of what we should be at. And so we need to build more affordable housing. So that was just my 2 cents on that. Thank you.
That's so great. All right. I want to thank all of you again. I feel like we could ask questions forever. But that was a fantastic conversation. I know that I learned so much. And for those of you that are on here that want to share it with folks, we've recorded and we can't wait to share it out more. And panelists, please feel free to spread the word about your great work and share this conversation as well. So we are going to get wrapped up. I liked that we ended with some next steps. I thought that was really covering a lot of these things we talked about in the right direction, supporting our local community land trust, checking out the Desegregate Connecticut for the zoning laws. I'm loving Fionnuala's Cancel the Rent sweatshirt. That was going to be my other question to talk more about, but look up Cancel the Rent and the movement for that, because that's also important. This was fantastic. Makita, you could go ahead and go to the next slide for me, please. And so some actual tangible next steps. There is a Southeastern Connecticut Community Land Trust meeting of the New London chapter tomorrow night. So if you're super interested, the email for Frida Berrigan, who has been helping run those, is on there. You can also contact me at Fresh New London, or Joanne if you want to throw your email, because I know you're on here, who is the chair of the board for the Land Trust, to talk more about that. But we'd love to see some more New London folks at that meeting. Support the organizations and that the panelists are from. Spread the word about Leon, who's an amazing realtor and is going to find all those hooked up resources for your people, right? And if you're just super interested about knowing more about how racism is impacting all of these social determinants of health, our next panel event is on May 26th. We're going to talk about access to care, specifically talking about Black maternal and infant health and the disparities that we're seeing there. So please join us. Oh, as well, Stephanie, you were telling us earlier, the author of The Color of Law, which we have as our additional resources, is also speaking tomorrow night. And if you could drop that event link in the chat, Stephanie, we would super appreciate that.
Gotta find it. I'll do it in a second.
Okay, you do that in a second. And the last thing I'm going to ask all you folks to do is participate in a quick poll for us. We just want to make these events the best that we can. So we have a little bit of a poll. Obviously, it also helps us maintain our funding and show how great we are. So I'm just going to go ahead and pull up the poll. And if you could take 5 minutes and fill that out, that would be great. There are 5 questions, so keep scrolling down. That'd be fantastic. Okay, and I'm going to launch that right now. All right, I can see some of you are filling this out. We got a few people. I would love to get a few more people. Oh, good, my numbers are going up. We're gonna leave it open for just another minute. All right, we got a lot of people, almost everybody. Great, and if you've taken the poll and you've written down the next date, you've got those resources. We're gonna go ahead and thank you and say good night. Thank you again to our panelists. This was a really great conversation. You'll be hearing from us for a follow-up and to invite you to the next event. And everybody have a fantastic night. Thank you so much.